The controversial Synod on the Amazon finally got underway in Rome this week. So far, it seems to be living up to the hype that has dogged it since the release of the working document this past summer, as it considers ordaining married men, women's roles in ministry, and much more. But overshadowing it all this week were comments made by Pope Francis, purportedly, during an interview with Italian journalist Eugenio Scalfari, an avowed atheist, nonagenarian, who never records or takes notes of his interviews. Now, Scalfari claimed that the Pope denied church teaching on the divinity of Jesus Christ. The Vatican almost immediately rushed out with a clarification and a denial. Joining me with analysis of this and much more is the Papal Posse, editor-in-chief of the CatholicThing.org, Robert Arroyo, and canon lawyer and priest of the Archdiocese of New York, Father Gerald Murray, both joining us from Rome. Gentlemen, thank you for being here. Now, let's get straight to what Italian journalist Eugenio Scalfari claimed in his frankly ridiculous column in La Repubblica this week. He wrote, quote, "Those who have had the chance, as I have had many times, the good fortune to meet him, the Pope, and speak with him with the greatest cultural confidence know that Pope Francis conceives the Christ as Jesus of Nazareth, man, not God incarnate. Once incarnated, Jesus ceases to be a God and becomes man until his death on the cross," end quote. Scalfari then writes that the Pope cited two moments from the Gospels where Jesus asked God the Father to take this cup from me, and when he cries out, "Why have you forsaken me?" as, quote, "the proven proof that Jesus of Nazareth, once he became a man, though a man of exceptional virtues, was not at all a God," end quote. Following the publication of the interview, the Vatican issued a statement saying, as already stated on other occasions, the words used, or the words that Dr. Eugenio Scalfari attributes in quotation marks to the Holy Father during talks with him cannot be considered as a faithful account of what was actually said, but rather represent a personal and free interpretation of he who listened, as appears completely evident from what's written today regarding the divinity of Jesus Christ. Another papal spokesman said during a presser today that the Pope never said this. Gents, this is not the first Scalfari interview which has resulted in controversy. Why is the Vatican, and the Pope, I suppose, so reluctant to just shut this guy down entirely?
Well, Raymond, probably our viewers don't know this, but Scalfari occupies an unusual situation in Italian journalism. He's sort of the grand old man of the more secular, atheist, Freemason side of Italian journalism. And so I think the Pope has tried to have this line out to this other element in Italy. Now, in my judgment, it has not been all that prudent to do this, as the two or three mistaken characterizations have shown.
This is the sixth interview or the sixth column that Scalfari has written about the Pope that has resulted in some kind of controversy.
Okay, so we've had a half dozen of these mischaracterizations come out, and I don't know why he keeps going back to him when Scalfari creates so many problems for the Pope. I often like to point out to people that in Italian, scaltro is very similar to scalfari. Scaltro means somebody who's wily and cunning. And I think that Scalfari tries to use opportunities like this week when lots of people are around for the Synod to push a line that makes people think that something is happening in the church that's not really happening. I wouldn't deny that in these conversations the Pope may have led him into temptation by saying ambiguous things or things that were not entirely clear. But I think a lot is being made out of this by people who would like this to perhaps be partly true. And I think most of us who know the situation here in Italy are not convinced.
Father Jerry, I had a bishop this week tell me that the Pope grants these interviews because he likes to mix things up. He likes to stir things up. Your reaction?
Well, the Pope has granted more interviews than any previous pope, so that's certainly the case. He enjoys this forum. But Scalfari is an unreliable reporter, and I wish the Pope would take that into account and spend more time with other reporters. I personally can't believe that the Pope would ever say anything like that. I don't think it's true. I think Scalfari is a ex-Catholic atheist, so I think he's trying to justify his own position in life. I hope I'm wrong about that. I hope this is all innocent, but for me, it sounds like just pleading a special case to try and say in the end, I'm the wise one because I figured out something, and he's going to attribute that to the Pope. It's false. It's not the case. Either you believe that Jesus is the Son of God or you don't, but don't try to claim that somehow the Pope is endorsing that view.
Gentlemen, the kickoff of the Amazon Synod was a very strange tree planting ceremony on the feast day of St. Francis in the Vatican Gardens behind you. Now, a focal point of the ceremony were indigenous Amazonians bowing down, including a Franciscan, before a wooden pregnant woman, this statue of a pregnant woman, in fact, a pair of them. Now, some said this is the Virgin Mary, Our Lady of the Amazon, visiting St. Elizabeth. During one of the press conferences on Monday, papal biographer Austin Ivory asked a bishop who works in the region about the statue. Listen.
On Saturday, during the celebration of St. Francis at the Vatican, some American media interpreted the figure of the pregnant woman as a pagan symbol of fertility. So how do you interpret this image? That was a very strong image. The woman, the Amazonian woman. So how is this indigenous figure considered? And what is the connection with the Synod? I did not perceive this identification. I'd seen this image on previous occasions. Probably those who used this symbol demonstrated wishes to refer to fertility, to women, to life. I don't think we need to create any connections with the Virgin Mary or with a pagan element.
Gentlemen, what do you make of this image of this fertility god, and what's the message here? Robert Royal.
Yeah, I was here when that happened, and I think that at that very moment, something happened that is starting to characterize this synod in a strange way. That something unique, something that we've never seen before on the Vatican grounds took place, and no one knows what it was. And no one is able to interpret it. No one seems to want to take responsibility for how it was organized, or who permitted it, and why the Pope was there, and what it meant for him to be a witness as this thing was going on.
Right.
So it's a tremendous confusion. And especially after many people, before the Synod even started, were pointing out that the dangers of this kind of syncretism, bringing in native elements that don't really accord well with Catholicism, was going to be confusing and lead us down strange paths. I think that the fact that no one can explain this is an additional problem, besides the fact that something that is not Christianity was celebrated on the grounds of the Vatican itself.
Father Jerry.
Right, Raymond, you know that...
Go ahead, Father.
The ceremony was accurately described as a pagan religious ceremony, and that statue is the goddess, false goddess, Pachamama, who is like a creation god. This is horrendous, I have to say. No matter what the intention of those who invited those people there, it's quite clear that that was a pagan ritual ceremony with religious meaning to them. This should not ever occur in a Catholic institution, certainly not in the Holy See. I regret that the Pope tolerated it. And I think the message has to be clear. Paganism is not here in the earth to teach Catholicism. It's the other way around. Catholicism is meant to overthrow pagan false notions. And certainly having a so-called inaugural religious ceremony blessing the Synod with pagan fertility. There was another statue of a male goddess, which was horrendous. I reject this completely. I think most Catholics do. I think the Pope in his kindness sat there and tolerated it. But really, whoever organized that imposed on the Holy See a very intolerable thing.
Well, it was a group of Franciscans committed to environmental reform, and a thing I have to point out, at the conclusion of this long ceremony, and they had tree planting and people bowing to the idols and the whole thing, the Pope cast aside his prepared remarks. He said, "And Our Father," and he left. I read that as sort of a subtle rejection of what he had just sat through.
Good. I think that's an accurate way to look at it.
Yeah, it may be, but at the same time, he'd been sitting in the sun for an hour at that point, and it looks like he was very, very tired. I don't think he wanted to stick around too much long maybe for various reasons. So even this, we cannot read with any great degree of clarity. And one of the problems with this papacy is the way that ambiguity and a lack of clarity has led to people having very grave doubts. And then now we have a generalized mistrust when a situation like this arises.
Yeah. Okay, we've got lots to get to. At the formal beginning of this synod, Pope Francis decried what he called racist language, and he said he was saddened by a joke about men who brought the offerings of to the altar with feathers on their head. These were the Amazonian indigenous peoples. And he said, what is the difference between this headdress and the tricorno, the beretta that officials of the dicasteries in Rome wear? Father Jerry, your reaction?
Well, you know, the Pope has expressed his displeasure with priests who wear what's called the saturno, which is the round Roman hat meant to be worn outdoors. You know, I think people are, I don't know what those specific criticisms were. Perhaps they shouldn't have been made. But to make a comparison between a beretta and a Native American or an Indian headdress from South America, okay, fine. We should never mock people. I agree with that. But you know, the beretta was actually worn during Mass, and is worn during the extraordinary form. It is a headgear that has religious significance. It's similar in religious significance to the zucchetto and the mitre. I mean, covering your head in the presence of God is an ancient tradition in Judaism and was carried forth into Christianity. So it has an importance, whereas headdress, from what I've read, using feathers of birds is sort of has some kind of pagan notion of unity with the heavenly spirits. So there is a difference per se. Who knows what was intended by the one who wore that feathered headdress.
Bob, they also said the Synod participants, they announced during the Synod that the Synod participants could dispense with the habits and, you know, their cassocks and wear black suits to the Synod. One bishop had no collar at all, I saw today. What's going on with this casual Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday Synod?
I'm going to pass this one to the cleric because we were talking about this earlier, and since he has a dog in this fight, I think he ought to answer that question.
Well, let's just say I wish I was in charge of protocol at the Synod, because I'm perfectly happy with cardinals wearing cardinal cassocks and bishops wearing bishop cassocks. You know, the cassock as a symbol has great power throughout Christianity because it is a form of dress which distinguishes the priest from everyone else. And when you come together in a synod, this isn't an ordinary meeting. This is an attempt, guided by the Holy Spirit and the doctrine and the tradition of the church, to understand how we make an outreach to the people in the present. And I have to say, whenever I wear my cassock in the church, people come up to me from time to time and say, Father, thank you for wearing that. When we see Dominicans and Franciscans in habits in the streets, we're inspired because this garment sets you off as a servant, as an apostle, as a missionary. So I think it was a mistake to do this because, you know, this is not a business meeting to discuss, you know, finances for how we're going to pay for the boiler repairs. I mean, this is trying to talk about God's will in the church and how we implement it.
Okay, I want to move on to some of the issues that they are wrestling with this week and for the next two. The chairman of the Synod on the Amazon, Cardinal Newman, wasted no time letting everyone know that this meeting is a search for, quote, new paths for the future. Then he said, quote, during the consultation stages, local communities, missionaries, and indigenous persons faced with the urgent need experienced by most of the Catholic communities in Amazonia requested that the path be opened for the ordination of married men resident in their communities, albeit confirming the great importance of the charisma of celibacy in the Church. Bob, what's the word on the ground about this proposal to essentially push a married priesthood? Is this a possibility?
Well, I think it's quite definitely a possibility, at least in terms of discussion. At the end of the day, the Holy Father, when he issues, if he decides to issue an apostolic exhortation after the Synod, will do what he wants to do with it. But look, a lot of things are being jammed together here. We've got the ecological side of this, and there are economics that are entering into it, and then there are these, the indigenous people are talked about a great deal. It's been said over and over again by people with some knowledge about Brazil and Peru that 2/3 of the indigenous populations in the Amazonia region, first of all, live in Peru. And most of them live in cities. Something like 80% of the people we're talking about live in cities. So the image that's being conveyed of sort of these simple tribesmen close to the earth with their sort of pagan traditions, that isn't the large number of people who are hurting in the Amazon. And in fact, several people have stepped forward and challenged some of the speakers to say, look, these people, especially women, leave their tribes and they go to cities where, of course, all the temptations and all the problems that always exist in an urban environment get exacerbated, because these are not the wealthiest cities in the world either. So in a way, they're pointing toward a problem, ordaining men supposedly out in the rainforest in the Amazon, when in fact the major part of the problem is in places where you could deal somewhat with the kind of Paris situations for the large majority of people who are so-called indigenous.
Father Jerry, Brazilian Bishop Erwin Krautler, who was part of the committee that developed this working document, had this to say about priestly celibacy at a press conference on Wednesday. He said, "We are not against celibacy. The question is how to enable access to sacraments. At the moment, we've placed celibacy above sacraments. That's not the gospel." He went on to say that the native people don't understand a priest without a wife, a priest that's not married. Father Jerry, are these credible arguments for dispensing with a 1,000-year-old discipline?
I don't think so, Raymond. I mean, Jesus Christ wasn't married. Can they understand Jesus? Of course they can. When the Franciscans and the Jesuits and the other missionaries went into South America and they had no wives, I think that was striking to these native people of South America, that here were a group of men dedicated to something that was completely not in their own self-interest, in the sense of bringing their wife and children here to take land. No, they were there to bring the gospel message, to live in poverty, and to teach people that there's something more in life than what we see, and that pagan notions are mistaken. God is not a God of natural forces of the earth or the wind or the sky or the sun. God is an incarnate man-made God, God-made man rather, who came into the world to redeem us precisely from these pagan errors which plunge people into ignorance, immorality, and unbelief. You know, the practice of infanticide among Native American, Indian Americans down in Latin America, something that has not really been focused in on the Synod, it's a problem. Yeah. Because, of course, paganism doesn't teach Christian solidarity. So when Bishop Krautler says you can't be credible if you don't have a wife, I don't believe that at all. And by the way, if you want Holy Communion for people who are living in the jungle, okay, we can ordain married men deacons, and they can distribute Holy Communion that's consecrated by a priest. But the priesthood is not just an alternate form of a local tribal custom, which it seems to be the idea here. We're going to ordain a men without training them in the seminary, little knowledge, and their job is just to celebrate Mass. No, no, no. Christianity is spread throughout the world by celibate priests for a reason, because that's the life that Jesus himself embraced, and it's the life that we try to embrace as best we can.
Cardinal, let me add a point, because I was in the room when he said that. Yeah, let me add a point, because I was in the room when he said that. And the first thing that came to my mind when he said that the indigenous peoples don't understand celibacy is, well, they don't understand incarnation either. Right. And they don't understand the Trinity either. So to me, this is, it's a fishy argument. Why are we focusing on that when there's everything that we believe as Christians has to be taught to them? Right. And so why is celibacy something that supposedly is so central to being able to preach the gospel that because they don't understand it, we can't practice it? No, we have to turn back to the kinds of practices where we know we have to bring the whole truth, the whole Catholic truth, to people who are suffering for lack of it. And I think that should be the focus, not some some cockamamie idea that, well, they don't understand this, therefore we can't preach it.
Cardinal Hummus also indicated, gentlemen, that the Synod won't stop with proposals to ordain men. He said, and this is a quote, "Faced with a great number of women who nowadays lead communities in Amazonia, there is a request that this service be acknowledged and there be an attempt to consolidate it with a suitable ministry for the women who live in these communities." Now, Hummus did not specify what that suitable ministry might be. Father, what are you all seeing there? It appears there are a lot of outside groups, NGO-type organizations, who are trying to put a fine point on what he means, mainly the ordination of women. I've seen some ladies with collars and things in the churches of Rome on the edges.
Well, I mean, we had a nun get up and say that she hears confessions without giving absolution.
Right, I'll
was
play
one of
that
the
in a
invited
moment.
Speakers at the press briefing the other day. Okay, good. We also had Bishop Crowther telling Edward Penton of the National Catholic Register that he's in favor of the ordination of women as deacons and as priests. Now, Crowther is the one who helped write the document. Now, let's face the facts here. There is an attempt to re-bring back to the public discussion an agenda that was destroyed by the clear teaching of the Church under John Paul II and Benedict, which is that Jesus' intention for ordaining only men is not clear. And the Church said, no, it's absolutely clear. The first priests were ordained at the Last Supper. They were all men. They are meant to be the living icon of Christ as priests. Christ is a man. The incarnation in the male of the species is not an accident or an incidental detail. It is essential to what the priest is. The priest is a father. The priest is the one who brings spiritual life to his children. The greatest saint in the Church is the Holy Virgin Mary. She is a mother. It's a different role. Women are not called to the priesthood. The Church has always taught that. For these bishops to bring this back is simply a revolutionary act, which is to the great discredit of the whole effort here, because this effort is about bringing the gospel to the Amazon, and unfortunately these bishops are trying to change the gospel. That is absolutely what's going on here.
When a journalist asked Bishop Crowther, who Father just mentioned a moment ago, about this push to ordain women, he said, why are women not able to be ordained? Why? Asked directly whether he supported the ordination of women as priests, he responded, yes, logically. Bob, what's the reaction to people covering and attending this synod when they hear those kind of sentiments?
Well, obviously people who agree with him are very happy that he's saying this, and an awful lot of other people are very puzzled. Again, with this argument, the way that this argument is being made is they're walking around, and everybody who supports that position seems to have the same statistics, that 80% of the indigenous communities in the Amazon are being led by women. I don't know how they possibly could know this, because the other thing they keep saying is that there are 20,000 communities, 6,000 without a priest. You know, in the United States, where we actually have good means to conduct surveys, if you tried to do a survey of all the storefront churches and the little, fugitive religious groups there, it would be very difficult to do. I don't know how they know in the jungle that there's this large number of people and that 80% of these groups are being run by women. And also the question has been raised, are they being run because the men don't think that that particular activity is something that a man should be doing because they have more important things, they have to earn a living or whatever it is? The form of this argument, too, I think is special pleading that Crowther is a very, very articulate man. He spent 30 years, he speaks beautiful Portuguese. He's a very articulate man, and he has strong opinions, but I think that the way that he's making these arguments just doesn't fly.
Okay. According to a nun, and Father referenced her before, Sister Alba Teresa, she lives in Colombia. Now, she claims women are already doing some of the work of priests. Here she is at the press conference, and she's saying here, we accompany the indigenous people, and when priests cannot be present, we perform baptisms. If someone wants to get married, we are present, and we witness to the love of the couple. We've often had to listen to confessions, but we have not given absolution. Father Jerry, is this licit?
As regards baptism and marriage, yes, because there are provisions in canon law when a priest is not able to come into a community, that baptisms can be performed by lay people and religious also, and the same with marriages can be witnessed. Now, the local bishop should be made aware of this situation and give his permission, but those two are permissible. Now, hearing confessions, meaning telling people, tell me your sins, that is wrong. If somebody wants to get spiritual guidance and discusses their problems in life, etc., that's fine. You can do that. Lay people can be spiritual directors, so can nuns and religious men. But to give the impression that I'm hearing your confession and somehow, I'm going to grant you the pardon of God through the church, that's wrong. That should never happen. It's misleading for her to use that word. So, yeah, I was upset when I heard that. I hope it's not true, because it's misleading people to think that non-priests can hear confessions.
Now, gentlemen, while we were talking about the synod taking place, it's being reported that Pope Francis has begun to eliminate restrictions on the activities of men who have been removed from the priestly state and allowed to marry. Now, this new rescript now states, quote, the dispensed cleric will be able to exercise those ecclesiastical offices that do not require sacred order with the permission of a competent bishop. So previously, laicized priests had to leave the area they once served and move where people did not know them as a priest, and they had other restrictions placed on them. Bob, is this the Pope's answer to the priest shortage worldwide? What's being allowed here?
Well, I'll let Father talk about the technicalities of what the Pope has proposed, but my sense is that we're at a moment, you see it in the Synod, you see in some of the other things, his recent reception of Father James Martin. I think that this is a moment when at least some people in the Vatican have decided that, as we say in baseball, they're really going to bring it. They're bringing a whole bunch of different things, and that because there are so many and they are so radical, it may very, very well be possible to advance a number of things that otherwise, if you did them singly over a long period of time, people would object to and would raise. I mean, they would be able to raise some sort of opposition. One of the striking things about this synod, as opposed to the previous synods, and we've covered these things in the past, is there's virtually no one inside the synod hall who thinks differently than what we've seen in that Instrumentum Laboris, the general line that they're taking about viri probati, roles for women, maybe relaxed ideas of what priesthood is. So there isn't much of a debate, I think, that is going to go on. I think this has been all kind of baked in at the beginning, and some of these external things now are being added because there's just this push at this moment, in my view.
Father Jerry, I want your reaction to this, and you can tie, to what Bob was just saying. In an interview this week, Cardinal Robert Sarah, who is participating in the Synod in his capacity as prefect for the Congregation of Divine Worship, responded to these proposals to ordain married men and the creation of women's ministries. He said, these points touch the structure of the universal church. Taking advantage to introduce ideological plans would be an unworthy manipulation, a dishonest deception, an insult to God, who guides his church and entrusts to it his plans of salvation. What is the average Catholic supposed to make of this? And as Bob said, the kind of radical hastening that we're seeing.
Well, this is something that really is part of the underlying crisis here, which is that the priesthood is a contradiction of secularist notions of human happiness. For the secularist, not being able to have sexual experience in life, having to live under the commands of someone else, embracing poverty, embracing, missionary spirit, this all goes against self-expression and self-will. And the glory of the church is that young men go into the seminary without preconditions and say, I will obey my bishop, I will go where I will send, I will leave aside wife and family in order to serve the spiritual needs of the church. And that is a big contradiction to this whole notion that, life is essentially about pleasure, power, and self-determination. So to give into that kind of spirit by having an ordained married clergy in the Western Church, I think would be a disaster. And I think it's very clear that, as we've been discussing, the problem in the Amazon is not that there aren't married clergy. The problem in the Amazon is that there hasn't been sufficient evangelization through all the parts of the church, lay people, religious, and priests. That's what we should focus in on. Yeah. But as if you read the press, there are bishops in Germany who are waiting for this, change in the Amazon to say, well, wait a minute. You're no priest in the Amazon? Have you heard about my diocese? We need some more priests. So I think the push here is basically undo celibacy as a mandatory rule, make the priest into more of a functional kind of experience. And then, quite frankly, this notion of giving up wife and children for the kingdom of God, putting that in the background, not talking about that. That's not the way you're going to save a sex-saturated society. People need to know there is more in life than simply your own self-interest. The interest of Christ and the church is what should come forward.
Okay, I've got about 4 minutes left. Bob, Cardinal Mueller suggested this week that this is basically, this Amazon Synod, a European progressive project in Amazonian garb. Those are my words, not his. Is that what you're seeing on the ground? And I need your reaction to this. The former theologian of the U.S. Bishops' Conference, Father Thomas Weinandy, wrote this week in the Catholic Thing that the Church is heading toward what he calls an internal papal schism, whereby Pope Francis effectively leads two opposing factions, one loyal to the papacy, yet critical of the pontificate, and the other supportive of him due to his tolerance of ambiguous teaching and pastoral practice. He said this is Father Weinandy, "Pray in fear and trembling that Jesus might deliver us from this trial. The Lord may want us to endure it, because only perhaps then may the Church be freed from all the sin and corruption that now lies within her and be made holy and pure." What does he mean there by an internal papal schism?
Yeah, I think what he means, and I encourage people to read that article because it really is a blockbuster. It came out earlier this week at the Catholic Thing, and you can see it on our website, thecatholicthing.org. He says that this has never happened in the history of the Church before. We've had corrupt popes, we've had bad popes, we've had popes that made enormous mistakes. But in this particular case, it could happen that some of the things that are coming down the line would make a schismatic church here in the Vatican itself, that the Pope would be actually the Pope of a church that had departed from the truths of the faith that had been held for 2,000 years. Now, it's a bold thought, of course. I haven't seen anyone else make it, but Father Weinandy is an extremely accomplished and honored theologian. He's a member of the International Theological Commission here in Rome. He was the head of the doctrine committee for the U.S. bishops for many years. So when a guy like that comes forth with this argument, I think we ought to pay attention. To go back to your first point about this, Cardinal Mueller is saying that this is a European synod.
Right.
It's strange that most of the participants are from Latin America, but as I was saying before, they were selected, I think, largely to reflect one point of view. And insofar as we can tell, there have only been 3 participants in the synod to date who have expressed any doubts whatever about the idea of ordaining viri probati, married men.
Right.
It's Cardinal Sarah. It's Cardinal Ouellet, who runs the Congregation for Bishops, and oddly, an African bishop, an African cardinal, Cardinal Turkson, who for whatever reason seems to think that he maybe ought to draw a line in the sand about this particular issue. So far as we know, in a meeting with, 200 people or so, there are 3 who might raise any voice against the more radical proposals, and that's never happened before. In the Family Synod, as you know, there was strong opposition to the direction it was taking. Before the second Family Synod occurred, 12 cardinals wrote privately to the Holy Father saying that they thought that the synod was being rigged. In the Youth Synod, there was a large contingent of Africans who said, we will not countenance any document coming out of this that has the letters LGBT in there. This time, there's no loyal opposition. It seems to be all people of one particular political orientation. So I think what Mueller means is that though they are not Europeans, they are oriented toward those European radical views.
Before I run out of time, I literally have a minute and a half. Cardinal John Henry Newman will be raised to the altar. He's going to be canonized on Sunday, October 13th. Obviously born in London in 1801. He founded the Oxford movement, which emphasized the Catholic roots of Anglicanism, and that caused a lot of clashes between he and the Church of England. He eventually left that church, joined the Catholic Church, was ordained a Catholic priest in 1846. Why is he being made a saint at this moment, do you think? Some have suggested that people are using this canonization almost as a distraction from what's happening in the Amazon Synod. Father Jerry.
Yeah, I don't believe that, Raymond. It's not a distraction. This is an event of divine providence. The miracle was approved. It's a wonderful miracle. John Henry Newman is such an illuminating figure for our time because he joined the Catholic Church from Anglicanism because he believed firmly and totally that the Catholic Church is the one true church. He believed for a long time in his life that Anglicanism was a via media, was a way between Protestantism and Catholicism. He came to understand that that view was wrong. Catholicism is the one true church. He wanted to serve Christ in the church that Christ founded. And he did so with extraordinary intelligence. He was a scholar of the highest degree. He was a man of great pastoral sense. He was a man of total dedication to fighting modern unbelief. If you look at Newman's writings, it's an attempt to understand the act of belief and how that is to be experienced in an unbelieving age. Bob has written about Newman. Bob has talked about him in his books. Newman is a seminal figure in the modern life of the church because his answer is what Christ and the apostles taught is as believable today as it was then.
Robert, what's the message for you in the Newman?
I also think that there of course are people who are trying to exploit him for various other purposes. For example, he has a very rich and interesting teaching about conscience. And conscience is something that's very much misunderstood in the modern world. People think that if my conscience tells me I can do something, it's okay. Newman, in an extremely striking phrase, said the conscience is the aboriginal vicar of Christ. The conscience isn't me. It is the deepest part of me responding to Christ himself. So we're going to hear some people saying, oh, Newman promoted the idea of conscience, and his view of the papacy was a little bit qualified. But Newman, properly read, comes over at a time when it was not all that advantageous to become a Catholic in the England of his day, and I think is probably one of the greatest Catholic writers in the English language. Not probably. I don't even know that there's anyone close to him.
Okay. We're going to have to leave it there, gentlemen. I thank you both for your analysis. Robert, we will check back with you next week and get the latest. Father Jerry, enjoy the limoncello. We'll talk to you all soon. Thank you.